Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Zachariah Mampilly. I'm a professor of public affairs and public policy and international affairs at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, City University of New York. Racism and protest in Africa. We are very, very excited for this panel today, which features really a stellar lineup of scholars and activists discussing the issue of police brutality and lessons that we can take from the African context. I want to introduce each of the panelists in 1 minute, but first let me just say a few remarks about how this panel will be organized today. First, let me start by thanking the online colloquium committee for organizing this panel, inviting all of us to participate. APCG has been engaged in a large number of activities trying to increase our outreach, especially to folks on the continent. So if you are in Africa and joining us, we really welcome you here today. And I encourage you to continue to follow the online colloquium committee and really all of what APCG is trying to do to bring more public-facing events around urgent questions facing the African continent today. Let me just mention at the outset that this conversation is being recorded and will be circulated after the event. So if you're unable to join us live, we look forward to you catching up at a later point. In terms of the structure of the conversation itself, I have prepared a number of questions for each of the panelists, which I have shared with them in advance. And they will each be given about 3 to 5 minutes to respond to each of these questions and to ask any follow-up questions if they have any. After that, we will open it up to questions from the audience, all of you. The approach that we're taking with the audience questions is that you need to write your question into the chat function, and they will be shared with me, and I will present them to the panelists about an hour into our discussion today. Okay, I think that's all I have in terms of logistics. Let me jump right into introducing each of our panelists, and then we will get to questions. First, we have Travis Curtice, Dr. Curtice, who recently finished his PhD at Emory University. Congratulations. Is currently a Dickey Fellow at Dartmouth University, who studies policing and repression in Uganda. Next, we have Mai Hassan. Mai is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. And she is currently working on a very, very exciting topic, which is Sudan's ongoing uprising, and we look forward to seeing what she comes up with there. Third, we are very lucky to have with us Alcinda Honwana. Alcinda is a centennial professor at the London School of Economics who studies youth politics and social movements. She is originally from Mozambique. And finally, on the line is Otsieno Namwaya, who is a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch based in Nairobi, Kenya. Unfortunately, Otsieno hasn't been able to get his video function to work, so he'll be joining us via phone, but I don't think that will hinder his ability to contribute to this conversation. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and start, and we will go first to Travis for question 1, and then we'll hear from the rest of the panelists. Black Lives Matter has helped put the subject of police brutality on the radar globally. While in some African countries like South Africa or Sudan, police brutality is highly racialized, in most others, race is not central to the debate. Can you speak about the utility, both positive and negative, of Black Lives Matter for the specific countries that you know best? Does framing police brutality through the lens of race help or hinder the understanding of the subject in Africa? And what are the other identity dimensions that we should be attuned to in the African context and beyond? Travis?
Great, thank you for that question. To begin, I want to just thank the panel organizers and my co-panelists for participating in this timely and important conversation. I think that now, this moment, looking at lessons that we can learn from African politics and applying that to the United States is especially important. My research focuses on the politics of policing and repression. Most specifically, I study how individuals view and form beliefs about the role of police in society. And in many societies, including the United States, the police are responsible for like 2 basic functions. On one hand, they are responsible for providing protection for the communities they are policing, ensuring the welfare of those they are tasked with protecting. However, on the other hand, they are responsible for protecting the political status quo as agents of the state. Often this means using force to repress political dissidents and keeping those who have power in power. In the last few months, we have seen thousands of protesters in the United States take to the streets to protest the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. Floyd's murder, about 2 months after Breonna Taylor was killed in her home by Louisville Metro Police Department officers, really, these extrajudicial murders are but the latest tragic reflection of an unjust criminal justice system that employs coercion, repression, surveillance, predation, and violence as mechanisms of control disproportionately meted out against Black and Indigenous communities. That is, these deaths, they didn't occur in isolation. Rather, they reflect an ongoing and systemic pattern of police abuse against minoritized communities within the United States. The Black Lives Matter movement, which formed after the tragic murder of Trayvon Martin, has become a rallying cry against police brutality that has far too often cut short the lives of Black men and boys like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and many, many others. Although the police in the United States are highly fragmented, both across and within the states, the protests have been national in response, with demonstrations in all 50 states. Others from around the world have also joined to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and against police brutality. And in the wake of the recent round of Black Lives Matter protests, we've also witnessed the expansion of highly politicized federal security forces engaged ostensibly to protect federal buildings, actually engage in excessive force against protesters, especially those in Portland, Oregon. But the question that you're asking is whether or not framing police brutality through the lens of race can help or hinder our understanding of the subject in Africa. And I think more importantly, what can our study of police brutality in Africa teach us about the US in this moment? I think certainly in some African countries like South Africa or Sudan, police brutality is highly racialized. Yet in general, race is not essential to the discussion of police abuse in much of the debate. That is, scholars rarely discuss African politics through a racial lens. However, it is the case that we can look at another ascriptive characteristic where we do often study within African politics, and that is the role of ethnicity. And ethnicity often plays an important role structuring systems of power, demarcating who is included or excluded. Ethnicity is often the focus of much of the study of politics in Africa. Perhaps on some occasions, ethnicity has too much attention, as Africa is certainly a monolith, and we need to see it as such. But yet, I think there are important lessons that the study of ethnicity can provide to our understanding of police abuse, crime, and the structuring of politics from Africa, and we could apply that to the United States. Related to policing specifically, I find in my work in Uganda that ethnicity becomes a powerful tool that both the government, citizens, and the police use in their interactions with one another. Ethnicity plays an important role in shaping how individuals view and interact with the police. I find, for example, that individuals strongly prefer reporting crimes to police officers who share their ethnicity. And then that's an analog that we could use in the United States, that maybe individuals from one racial group would prefer interacting with police officers from another racial group. But in addition to ethnicity, I find that individuals' level of trust in the government is also important. So it's not just about ascriptive identity or just representation, it's about individuals' attitudes towards the system themselves. Specifically, I find that the effect of co-ethnic bias almost doubles when people say they have no trust in the various government institutions. And this pattern holds for people who say they have no trust in the police, in the courts, in the criminal justice system, and in the executive, President Museveni. So what might this imply? I think it suggests that we can't see co-ethnic bias, or in the United States, racial bias, as just a lack of representation or staffing within a police force, but we must see it as a function of how individuals see the role of police in society, how power is structured. Minoritized groups can be added to the police force, but the system of how power is allocated, who holds that power, and how that force is used also matters. I think our study of African politics shows that identity matters in the way that people navigate these interactions. And I'll just conclude and then
with that, and let's move on to May.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much again for Zachariah for leading this, and for Amanda and Natalie for organizing it. I wanted to pick up on some of Travis's comments, and I really agree that the Black Lives movement in the US has really brought salient identity cleavages to the forefront, not just in the US, but across the world. And so, whereas in the US, it's mostly about race, many region or race itself. And I think that framing it in terms of whatever ism we're talking about, whether it's racism or regionalism or ethnocentrism, that can be useful for at least 3 different reasons. I think it's really useful in highlighting the institutional inequalities that exist within a country. I think it's really useful for thinking about social discrimination between or within these different identity groups. And I think also picking up on something that Travis mentioned, that given that many countries across the world, not just in Africa or the US, have these salient identity cleavages, we can use this fact to try to think of creative policy solutions that might mitigate police brutality in the future. So as Zachariah was saying, my most recent research is thinking about the Sudanese uprising and just Sudanese society in general. And as someone who's Sudanese, these are questions that I've thought about for my whole life. And so something I keep thinking about, especially with regards to the BLM movement, is that there's so much institutional regionalism and discrimination against Sudanese who are from the West, from Darfur, or Southern Sudanese who, yes, have their own country now, but many of them still live in Northern Sudan. And these groups have historically been more disadvantaged, have not had as many government or colonial resources as the North. And so have just been much more disadvantaged. But also there's a very clear racial or regional element between, Africans or Arabs or however you want to describe it. And you can see elements of how the state is using these salient identity cleavages that emerged in the past and continue to the present to further their own agenda. And so the regime during the uprising that took place in 2018, 2019, tried to paint a lot of the instigators of this uprising against autocracy and tried to pin it on a lot of Darfuris from the West, saying like, these people are not Sudanese, they're destroying the stability that Arab Sudan has achieved. And this was perpetuated further by thinking about who the state used to stop and try to stymie the uprising by bringing in the Janjaweed, the rapid support forces, which were largely composed of one ethnic group, the Arab Darfuri tribes, and having them really wreak a lot of violence against African or Sudanese of African Darfuri backgrounds. And so it's thinking about BLM makes us realize how many of these institutional forms of racism or regionalism in different countries can come out, not just societally, but also through the state even to today. At the same time, I want to mention that I think the idea of framing BLM as solely about identity cleavages can still be limiting, in that in many of these countries, in Sudan, in many other unconsolidated democracies, transitioning countries, autocracies, if we just frame it as us versus them, police are one ethnic group and discriminating against or engaging in extra brutality against specific groups, we're taking away from the fact that many of these states and many of these police have way too much power. They're not being monitored in correct ways. They're just given wide latitude to engage in a lot of brutality that, if we just frame it in terms of race, I think takes away from the fact that it really hinders the democratic transitions of many of these countries.
Okay, thank you. Alcinda?
Thank you, Zachariah, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I'll follow up from Travis and May. I will not go through the kind of general framing of the response, which I think they have done very well. I think I'll just jump straight into my own research, because I think in a way what resonated in some of the places that I've been working with young people and the communities involved in protest is that people domesticated and found ways of understanding what was going on here with BLM in their own contexts. For example, Travis has mentioned that South Africa, Sudan, and May too, and that those were places where race resonated very clearly. And although my work in Tunisia was not focused on race issues, but on the uprising and the protests, there is a racial issue going on in Tunisia. Although Black Tunisians are just 15% or slightly less of the population, there's no clear statistics, there is a lot of a sentiment of discrimination amongst Black Tunisians. And for that particular group, what was happening in the United States in terms of Black Lives Matter also resonated to them in terms of racial discrimination. And although the Black Tunisians are a small minority, there is another phenomenon going on in Tunisia, is that there are quite a large number of West African Black students in Tunisia. And they suffer a lot of racism and discrimination as well. And that came up in my research, because one of the things that when I was there last year, there was a lot of discussion about the killing of a Black student called Falikou Koulibaly. He was the president of the Ivorian Association of Students in Tunisia. And he was brutally killed and tortured, apparently with no reason, just because he was Black. And that created a bit of a reaction, and there were demonstrations by African Black students, but also some Tunisians participated. But there is this underlying tension within Tunisian society about race and about the fact that Black Tunisians and people coming from sub-Saharan Africa are less important than the so-called white Tunisians. And that also is aggravated with the migration towards Europe, that many young Africans pass by Tunisia, either on the way to Libya or to try and cross to Lampedusa in Italy. And some of them, they overstay, some might even come with a visa, but they overstay the visa to do petty work to get some money to continue the journey. And so that also creates some tensions in terms of race, and so that is an issue. But I think in general, in other places that I have been working on, the issue is not so much about race, but it's more about the brutality, the repression that comes in the form of repression of the state over citizens. And of course, it can have different contours, can be ethnic, can be regional, but it can be just the fact that you are in the opposition, that you have a different view, no matter who you are, but if you are a dissent view, you are considered someone that the state will come after you. And so I think for most, for example, in places like Mozambique, Senegal, Burkina Faso, this idea of the police being the arm or the representatives of the state in terms of crashing down or on demonstrators, on protesters, on youth groups that are trying to put pressure on the establishment for change. And that we have seen in different demonstrations and protests all over the continent, police, using tear gas, water cannons, rubber bullets, but even real bullets, and people being killed. For example, in Senegal, I think in 2018, there was an uprising, a demonstration in saying that, we should be able to do political protests without being repressed. It is our constitutional right. And so there is that tension, but I think it's citizens and the state in which the police appears as an arm of the state in that direct connection with protesters and people who are contesting the state.
Thank you so much, Otsieno?
Thank you, Zachariah. I've worked on police issues in Kenya for over 6 years now. But the kind of work that we do at Human Rights Watch is not exactly academic research. It is mainly human rights research. It's quasi-academic. And our focus in Kenya has mainly been on police brutality and the lack of accountability in policing. As a result of which there have been discussions around reforming police to conform to international norms and regulations. So I may not have worked directly on issues of racism and policing, but there are issues that, or overtones or undertones that would likely emerge from our work on the issues that are emerging from the Black Lives Matter movement. Human rights research is normally very narrow, so it may not touch on so many of the issues that you may be interested in, but I'll make a presentation on some of the issues that have come up that may relate to the Black Lives Matter in a very remote way. So Kenya Police was created during the colonial period, I think around 1907. And at that time, it was mainly serving to protect the interests of the colonial government and the white minority. And that went on until independence period in 1963, when it was expected that these changes with independence, the police will be transformed and begin to serve the wider public and basically enforce the law across board. But that didn't happen. What happened is that police became more like an appendage of the state and served the interests of the people who had taken over government at that time. That was a very elitist Black rulership. And that meant at that time, the police were used mainly to target people who seemed to dissent or disagree with the mainstream view. But things have since evolved from then, especially with the multipartism and dissenting opinion becoming more common. And what has happened is that then police brutality has continued, but along certain lines, depending on what is happening and the deployment of police, what it has come, why the police have been deployed. There have been forms of discrimination that may speak to Black Lives Matter movement, depending on when police have been deployed. So there are three incidents or scenarios where we find police are deployed. And I want to just discuss how each of those play out.
Okay, so can you wrap up in like 1 minute, please?
So there's election-related policing. In this election-related policing, what we see is discrimination along ethnic lines. So the communities that do not support the leader or the president are targeted by the police in election-related policing. And then there's crime-related policing, where the targeted group is mainly the poor people in the slums, but you don't see that kind of brutality in high-income areas. Then there is other law enforcement deployments, such as during demos and riots. In that case, though, there is targeting of anyone who is in a riot situation. And yeah, basically that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your background comments here. It's very helpful, I think, especially in relation to the next question, which we will start with Maya this time. So at core, I think as Travis already has mentioned, the debate around policing has to do with what the role of police in any society is. On one side are those who view police primarily as a necessity to maintain public order and protect private property. On the other are those who suggest policing should be concerned with ensuring the welfare of communities, especially the most marginalized. Is it possible to reconcile these two views in the African context? do demands for abolishing the police resonate in contexts in which the marginalized communities suffer the most from public disorder? May?
Thanks, Zachariah, for that question. I've been grappling a lot with calls to abolish the police and trying to think about how that would work in the context in Africa that I know. And something that I think we have to remember is that in many African countries, the state capacity is just much lower than what we have in the US. And so in part because of that, it's really unclear what the primary function that police are carrying out. And so while we here in the US might idyllically, not that it happens in real life, but idyllically we want the police and the entire administrative state to serve as an agent of the people living here. In a sense, we want the police to serve and protect. But if we look at the reality on the ground in Africa, police in many of these countries are not even able to do their most basic duties. So if we think about protecting private property, many, especially middle to upper class Africans have privatized their own security. They hire their own guards. They erect fences. They use safes to hold their valuables. If there's a crime in a neighborhood, yes, I mean, sure, the police should maintain law and order, but we often see residents instead resorting to mob justice, to social shaming of those who are the expected perpetrators. And so at least in my mind, then the police and the security apparatus more general in many of these countries, I see it less so as an agent of the people, but more so an agent of the regime. And so police in many autocratic countries in Africa or countries that are transitioning away from autocracy, trying to become more democratic, instead the police and the security apparatus are really trying to uphold the regime, or at least elements of it. So for instance, if we think about using the police to go attack political opponents, or if we think about Africa's place in the global system and hinting and discussing a little bit of what Alcinda was talking about, many police are used to stymie migration of their own people to Europe. And when the police are not well funded, they become agents of a specific politician or warlord who can pay them well. And so in thinking about this question about abolishing the police, or the security apparatus more general, in African countries, I think it's more so about ensuring democratization. And I think in that sense, the BLM movement here in the US is in a sense catching up to where Africa is and seeing what the police can do to uphold really undemocratic norms. And here in the US, we're starting to finally unpack that really rosy picture that we have of or maybe many of us didn't have that picture in the first place. But as a society, getting rid of this idea that the police is just there as an agent of the people, but that's actually not being the case. And so I think Africa in this sense is at the forefront of that movement.
Thank you, May. And I should point out that we have a question from somebody based in, I think, Cairo, asking what the call for abolish the police or defund the police is coming from. So just to provide some context, I meant to do that earlier. So within the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, there are some, I don't think it's everybody within the movement, who are suggesting that the real problem is that too much state and local funds are devoted to policing, which is an empirical fact. Well, not, I guess it's an opinion, but there is a large percentage of state and local budgets that are devoted to policing issues. And there have been calls from a number of activists that suggest that this is money that is misdirected, that police don't actually serve the function that they're supposed to serve, and hence what should be done now at the local and state levels is actively defunding police departments, if not abolishing the police altogether. And this is obviously a controversial perspective, but one that has significant support within some elements of the Black Lives Matter movement, and hence the question. And we'll go to Alcinda next.
Thank you. Yes, I think it is important to look at the police doing both functions. I think it is possible. I don't think those are contradictory. But the problem now is that what kind of police do we have? And the training that police force has. They are not prepared as a force that is going to protect the community, especially the most vulnerable and underprivileged. The police in most African countries is protecting the establishment, it's protecting the regime, it's protecting the state. But again, it's a police that is heavily underfunded. also sometimes with a weak training. And so it's very easy to get the police involved in corruption, in trafficking networks, being it drugs or human traffic or car dealings and etc., even robberies. You know, there are countless stories in Mozambique and other places, South Africa even, of the police involved with networks of criminals, etc. And I think it's that idea of, you know, police not being trained as a force to engage and protect the community, but to engage the regime and protect the regime. And depending on the interests of that regime, their work would be either to crack down on anyone who has dissent voices, or within, and as May mentioned, within the regime, there are special forces, for example, rapid intervention forces that are controlled by the Ministry of Interior or are controlled by the Defense Ministry, etc. And so it's a very repressive apparatus that exists. And in some cases, the army also gets involved. For some riotings, you see governments deploying the army, etc. So I think we have a long way to go. And I think this, to a certain extent, what happened in the US and the way it kind of got spread, this kind of police brutality and the way that the killing of George Floyd happened, it kind of resonated with how people see the police in general, and they could relate to their own experience. It might not be a knee on the neck, but it's that repression, it's that disregard, it's that lack of dignity that people get from the regime, and that is expressed through the actions of these police, the police force that interacts with people directly. I think I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Alcinda. Otsieno, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think part of the problem in Africa is that the accountability mechanisms for police have mostly collapsed. And therefore, a lot of the police actions go either unpunished, sometimes even unnoticed. And when that happens, you find there are so many incidents that are fall under policing, which are basically because of individuals within the police who feel they can get away with anything, and therefore they can misbehave, and they find there's a lot of misconduct because they know they'll get away with it. But there are also cases of misconduct which are sanctioned by the state. To that extent, you find that police in Africa become very difficult in trying to protect the welfare of the majority citizens. They begin to act only in pursuance of the law, where they are protecting the interests of the leaders. Otherwise, anything beyond that, or anything that is not that, police become chaotic, violent, and reckless. Thank you.
Thank you, Otsieno. Travis, do you want to go?
Yeah, great discussion. I think it really circles back to something that May said, in answering your first question, that I think often when we think about the BLM movement, if we think of it only about race, we're actually missing a point. And I think that the call to defund the police is actually tying into this. And I think that in many ways, this is something that scholars of African politics can really contribute to the conversation. When we think about police brutality in the US, it's often a discussion centered around a racial lens, whereas police violence in Africa is more likely to be discussed as coercive action that's done by the state. And so it's centering that it's not just the police acting as a few bad apples, it's actually the police acting as an extension of the state itself in the interests of the regime. And often in the American context, we're not having that conversation. We're discussing the police as maybe this is some implicit bias issues. And I think that the call to defund the police in many ways is echoing this call of that there's a systematic problem in the way that the police are actually engaging marginalized communities, minoritized communities within the United States. And that's, I think, a discussion that many within Africa and politics have had for some time, whether or not it's the police structured to target opposition groups or targeted to actually predate on the poor rather than serving the marginalized communities. And I think that this is an important conversation to have. I think that if we step back and look at the United States history and kind of take off our rose-colored glasses for a moment, as May said, that maybe some of us haven't worn, and we remember the role of violence from the founding of the United States, including the role of slavery, violence against indigenous communities, the Jim Crow era, and how the policing institution was kind of emerged in response to actually not just policing and serving the people, but actually controlling people who are deemed as those who need to be kept outside the political power. I think that that reveals much about the United States and maybe the strength or the weaknesses and fragility of our democracy and as our society as a whole. I think that what happens if we step back and we view the police in the United States, their structure, their unions, their trainings, their deployments, their level of funding, as you mentioned, Zachariah, and in particular, their disproportionate violence against minoritized communities, we view those as outcomes that are more a feature rather than a bug of the US system. I think that it leads to a really important conversation about the strength of our democratic process. What happens when the police are providing security at elections, for example? We have lessons of that in the context of Kenya. We have lessons from looking at how police are politicized around elections in Kenya, for example. Let's apply those lessons to the United States as we approach the upcoming US elections. What happens when we over-politicize the police? I think that has dire consequences, and it underserves those who especially need it, the marginalized communities. Leave it at that.
Thank you. And so I have one final question. Let me just encourage all of you who are contributing questions to the chat function or the Q&A function. Please keep those coming. I think I've seen 2 that I'll ask after this round, but if you have others, please do share them. So the final question that I have for the panelists, I think is related to this, I think, very interesting comparative discussion we're having here about the differences and the similarities in regards to police brutality in the African context versus North America. And I think one of the most striking aspects that we have seen is that there's been this massive disparity in the attention paid to protests around police brutality and state repression in Africa versus those in Europe and North America. Protests in Africa, even when they achieve remarkably large scales, often receive scant attention compared to their counterparts in the US and Europe. And so my final question is, how do you account for this difference? And why should scholars and activists in the West pay more attention to popular movements in African countries? And this time we're going to start with Alcinda, and we'll continue from there.
Thank you, Zachariah. I think it's not just a question of the media and how media attention is placed, but it's also you know, how do we understand these processes in different contexts? I would start with looking, for example, at the Arab Spring in 2011. The Arab Spring was a major uprising that shook the entire world, and the attention was quite great. There was a lot of attention because it was, you know, since May 68, this is a kind of the largest youth uprising of our days. But the way the media covered it was informed by a worldview that placed those North African countries outside of Africa. So it was portrayed as an Arab, an Islamic uprising, and there was a whole discussion on whether Islam was capable of reforming itself. And of course, it didn't work in Egypt because it wasn't possible, but they ignored completely a number of processes that preceded the Arab Spring in Africa. And I think your book and Adam's talks about that quite a lot. A number of uprisings due to pressures of neoliberal economic policies, of lack of democratization, lack of engagement and space for the people, the fact that the social contract between citizens and the state was not upheld. So there were a lot of demonstrations, a lot of collective action by Africans that it went unnoticed. But when the Arab Spring happened, people were unable to see that there was a huge neoliberal critique within those uprisings. The problem of the graduates, the graduate unemployment, the social inequalities, the Tunisia of the interior and the Tunisian of the coast, ideas about secularization versus Arabophonization or religion. And a number of issues were played into that. But I think it's that, and also has to do with, for us in academia, we need to rethink theories on social movements, on non-contentious politics, because for a long time, the literature has been really based on Europe and North America. Has been a very Eurocentric, very Western view of processes of nonviolent contestation. And we have always in the South, in the periphery, been seen as the violent ones, the ones that cannot reason and discuss things peacefully, with a few exceptions of South Africa during apartheid, etc. But I think the media picks up on that. It picks up on the politics of the day. It picks up on, neoliberalism and those kinds of liberal democracy politics. But it also picks up on the way we academics have been dealing with issues of nonviolence contention in the global South, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Alcinda. Otsieno, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it is largely to do with the flow of information between the global North and the global South. I think the media in the global North is better funded, has better structures, has better personnel, and has wider reach than any other media you can find in the global South. And a lot of the media in the global South basically relays the news that is aired or published by the media in the global South. And because of that, I think the events in like the protests that we saw in the United States get wider coverage and therefore better traction than anything that's happening in Africa. A lot of the events in Africa, unless they're monumental and there's a lot of loss of lives, is likely not to get attention globally because it will be competing with other items in the other media houses, which are not of interest to the West. And a lot of times that will not get attention. So that explains why sometimes if there's violence in Africa and 20 people die, and there's violence in the United States and 1 person dies, it's likely the violence in the United States where 1 person died gets more attention than the violence in Africa where 20 people died. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Travis next.
I think that the question of why should scholars and activists in the West pay attention to popular movements in African countries, I think about some of my research on Uganda. In the summer of 2018, Robert Chagulanyi, Bobby Wine, engaged in a protest. He organized a protest against the over-the-top social media attacks that the government had passed. It was basically attacks on social media activities on phones, and it was a way of kind of regulating the flow of information which Bobby Wine had just used to win his election. And so it was the government's response of shutting down that information flow. And so in opposition to the attacks, Bobby Wine takes to the streets of Kampala. He's organizing this rally. And the police responded with repression. They arrested Bobby Wine, they arrested his supporters. And I actually used that moment to study how attitudes towards the police themselves actually shift based on Bobby Wine's arrest. And what I find is that Ugandans actually, after Bobby Wine was arrested by the police, their beliefs in the legitimacy of the police themselves went down. So it actually negatively affected public perception of the police. They were less likely to be willing to cooperate with the police, less likely to trust the police, less likely to see the police acting in fair procedural ways. And I think that looking at studying that in the Ugandan context has implications for how we understand protests in the United States. What happens when the United States, when the police one protest, one rally, let's say the March for Our Lives in the United States, differently than a BLM protest? What are the implications then for those communities in the way that they perceive and view the police? I think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn in studying those dynamics. And then also, as Alcinda mentioned, not just looking at Africa for lessons of violence, but actually looking at Africa as lessons of these creative ways to overcome collective action. And so like the Mom's Wall in Portland, Oregon received this like applause for like, look at this radical way of engaging in protests. And if you actually step back, those lessons are there if you would actually look in the African context and see mothers organizing, or looking at like activists like Stella Nyanzi within Uganda organizing women protesting against the government. And so I think that those lessons are also important in this political moment in the United States.
Great. And last up we have Mai.
Great, thanks. So in my mind, I think that so many social movements in Africa are exceptional, that they're not only long lasting, but in many cases they sustain long-lasting mobilization against really intense police brutality, much worse than not that it's justified or comparisons or anything like that, but it's much worse than the brutality that we're seeing here in the US. And so just to talk about the case that I know best, so thinking about Sudan's uprising against the former Inqaz regime, it began in December of 2018 and persisted until July 2019. So that's more than 6 months of mobilization. It was complete with multiple marches in the capital of hundreds of thousands, if not at least 1 million people, and a 9-week sit-in in front of the military's general command, actually in the front of the military's general command. And yet from where I'm sitting, outside of the first few protests in December and the 2 large protests in the spring, I feel as though the world barely took notice. And so given the true awesomeness of this movement and so many other movements, I'm really taken by this question as why, I'm really surprised as why there's not much more attention to that. And in thinking about it, I think it's really, part of the reason is it's just difficult to sustain attention on long-lasting movements. If something lasts 6 months, other stuff comes in that you're thinking about. We're starting to even see this fatigue right now in the US with the BLM movement. And we're not focusing on it as much as we were back in June. But then going a little bit deeper, I think that there are more long-lasting movements in Africa in part because of the nature of the societal context. And so if we think about the BLM here in the US, many activists are actually coming up with concrete demands, a list of concrete demands of things that they want to see, actionable items. And there are so many numerous layers of government and so many different entry points for these activists to make their concrete demands into law, to actually see real reform. There are vibrant civil society groups that exist, or as Charles was talking about, this wall of malls that just emerge organically but more so the ones that already existed that have experience fighting the state, using the political process. But in Africa, I feel as though we see a lot more negative revolutions or negative mobilization campaigns where there's a large topic that mobilizes a lot of people. The state is corrupt. The regime has to go. Let's tear it all down. And that's all fine and good, and it's definitely necessary in many of these contexts. But at the same time, with decades of authoritarianism behind them, and in democratic contexts, lack of proper funding or just the not high enough incomes of many of these people to be able to sustain multiple interests outside of just, you know, living a working wage. Many of the institutions that we think are critical to the success of societal movements, opposition parties, civil society groups, vibrant think tanks, just don't exist. And I think that's something, I didn't want to end on a negative note, but I think that's something that we really do have to consider. And so thinking about Alcinda's comment about how we have to reconceptualize societal movements or social movements in Africa, given that so many of them are these big negative revolutions, which are really extraordinary. How do we, as scholars and for those of us who are policymakers, how do we translate these big negative revolutions into actual lasting change so that not everyone becomes in Egypt, right? But that we actually see, for instance, what's happening in some cities in the US with the BLM actually making concrete demands and seeing those demands being made into law in those countries for cities.
Thank you, Maya. This is a really interesting conversation. I would love to jump in here, but I'm going to refrain because we have actually some really interesting questions from the audience. And I think it's best we turn over our remaining time to all of you who are asking questions and our panelists to weigh in. Let me just add that if you are trying to figure out how to ask questions, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and that's where these conversations are happening. You also have the capacity to vote up or vote down these questions, but I think right now I'm going to try to get to as many as possible. So I'm going to jump right in here, and I'm going to ask, I think maybe I'll try to combine some questions because some of these are quite long paragraphs, long statements, which is why you should read the whole question. But let me start with the two questions that are in the answered section of the Q&A box. The first from Elvis and the second from Sawik. Thank you both for your questions. So from Elvis, we know that there has been numerous attempts to address the issue of police brutality in Kenya and Uganda through legislation, but clearly this is not enough. In your view, what are some of the radical steps that can be taken to reform policing in the region? Should the head of the police be made elective positions? And let me ask one more question and then I'll turn it back to the panelists, who should feel free to answer any of these questions or none of them. Second, from Sawik, how do we reconcile the need for police in Africa with the fact that most places are already under-policed or the police is grossly incompetent or employ extreme brutality? Who wants to start? Feel free to jump right in.
I'll be brief because it touches on Kenya. I'll be brief, and it touches on some of the things, the issues I've worked on. I think the main problem why some of the legal reform measures have failed is political. So in the event that there's lack of political will, you can do all that you need to do. You can create the best laws, but they will not be implemented. And that's the problem that Kenya faces today, because the constitution is good, the laws creating accountability mechanisms for the Kenya police are very good and can be very effective if enforced. But when government changed in 2013, I think those in power just were not interested because they were also facing some cases at the International Criminal Court, and they thought it's better if police stays the way it is. So that has remained the problem. But I don't think turning the police inspector general's position elective is going to solve the issue. I think the main thing is the presidency and the executive developing more appetite for police reforms and a better working police service. Thank you.
Travis?
Yeah, I think that the lack of political will is even more complicated in Uganda, because it's not just a lack of political will, but it's actually the reliance on the state apparatus, on the police in order to maintain power. And so actually using the police as its key repressive apparatus in day-to-day ordinary forms of repression in order to maintain the existing political status quo. And so like Kilkahua, who was the former Inspector General of Police, he basically was responsible for turning the police into the existing repressive apparatus that it is now, away from the military as it was previously. And so asking questions like Sawik's question about what about those who are already under policed, from my work in Uganda, I find that even areas that have higher levels of police, what we actually observe is an empirical pattern of higher levels of repression, but we don't actually observe better policing outcomes. So we don't observe less crime, we just observe higher levels of policing. And much of that's because it's a selection effect that's driving it, where the police are being deployed into higher opposition areas. And then there's even less trust in the police because they're not there to investigate muggings or to serve the people themselves. They're there to protect the interests of the state. And so it has to be this kind of fundamental shift in the way that the police are structured.
Thank you.
If I could take a stab at it too. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, especially seeing the reforms that some people are calling for here in the US, is that police should be from the area that they're policing. And if these police officers are more embedded in their societies and more embedded in their communities, I think that's it also has negative consequences, but it might be a really good way to ensure that police see the people that they're supposed to be protecting and serving as some of their own, and that they really feel for the actual needs of those people and are fighting for them every day. And so in thinking about more simple policy solutions, instead of deploying police to go to any which area, but instead like recruiting locally, training them locally, having more community and police dialogues, I think that could really start to break down some of the barriers and the mistrust between police and who they're policing.
Please, Alcinda.
Just make a short comment. I think it is important to also look at police reform in the broader context, because the state of the police in many African countries reflects the state of general affairs in the country, and we cannot isolate the police from a number of other processes going on. So in a sense, the police reform in itself, it's not going to solve the problem. There are structural problems about serious, social economic inequalities. There are problems about people having a voice and being able to engage with the government or the state. There are problems about the social contract. And so I think the police, apart from being this agent of repression from the regime, and that's a regime that is already fragile and has to kind of rule by repression, the police is also suffering a number of other ills that emanate from the broader community, like, social economic problems, etc. That's why they get into dealings and networks that have nothing to do with their primary function. But also it's a question of the state realizing what is the use that we want to get to the police. And that takes us back to the second question that we were discussing, whether it's possible to reconcile the two. And it is there, and that reconciliation comes from reconceptualizing the notion of police and policing and the linkages between community and policing. And that has to do also with the training and the preparation. I agree that it is important that there is a relationship with empathy between the police officer and the community. But in many African countries, for example, it is important also to have people from different areas, different ethnic groups interacting with one another, because that's when you start breaking those barriers, that I will not just be protected by my own, but kind of build this idea of a nation. Looking at a place like Mozambique, that is a very long country, it's important to use those state institutions to break barriers of ethnicity, of race, and those kinds of things. Thank you.
Okay, great. I want to introduce two new topics here. The first, I think we've already started talking about it, but it comes from Caden Paulson-Smith. Specifically, where does the idea come from that the state, and by extension the police, is meant to be an agent of the people? If the predecessors of the modern police were designed to serve the state and white settlers and protect their property, how might Africans reconceptualize this institution and its mandate, if not abolish it? And the second topic, I think there's 2 or 3 questions that touch on these. I'm just going to pose them jointly, and you should feel free to answer them however you want to. So the first, from Jeremiah Mitoko, can any of the speakers add to the issue of special forces, for example, anti-riot units, and their training and funding? Also, the absence of local institutional legal framework to regulate the activities of these forces. Similarly, Matthew Lariche asks, can the panel reflect on the role of militarization and paramilitarization of police and security services, links to authoritarian and nationalist regimes? And finally, from Jessica Piombo, how do we refract these issues through the multiple policing agencies that exist in many countries? Multiple agencies, multiple authorities, often overlapping. This makes reform more difficult. Are there examples from African countries that speak to some aspect here? Who wants to jump in?
Well, let me just, I'm not somebody who studies police or anything, but just to give an example, I was living in South Africa and teaching at UCT when the end of apartheid happened. And one of, and I had very strong links with a research center linked to the university. There was the Center for Conflict Resolution. And one of the big problems during apartheid was the relationship between the townships, so the Black communities, with the police. The South African police, that was kind of a, the relationship with the communities was very racialized and abusive and repressive, etc. And so in the, in the end of apartheid, everyone wanted to kind of, get in and try to build a new society. So the center started the project on reforming the police, and this was in Cape Town. And so the project was using certain police groups within the community and community groups to start an engagement and a conversation, because what they realized was that there was no knowledge of each other. The police came as this repressive force, but they had no understanding of the community, and there was no interaction at all. And so for many years, that project was very successful, and community and police forces started developing a different kind of relationship. But of course, the situation in South Africa did not improve much, as we all know. So, and I left South Africa, I never followed up on that experience. But it's just an example that, sometimes we cannot just wait for the big change to happen structurally, but communities can organize themselves, because I don't think all policemen are, bad in the sense that they're inclined to harm, but they are operating within a system that is constraining them and that has molded them as well. And so how to start breaking those barriers? I understand, and we've been talking, and I even mentioned that it's important to rethink, reconceptualize, etc., etc. But those are bigger questions. How can we start small? And probably that experience from Cape Town could be something to think about.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think this is a very pertinent question and a difficult one to ask, because in some ways it is getting to the core of what we are bringing people together to discuss, which is the parallels across African countries and between African countries and the United States. And for those of you who are not in the US, we've been dealing with this question of multiple overlapping security forces in response to the protests over the past few months, as Black Lives Matter has started to increase its presence on the streets in a variety of different locations. Some of you may have heard that in places like Portland, we've had these anonymous forces that are unclear which agency they're connected to, but that dress almost as paramilitary forces and who are been deployed on the streets in places like Portland to disrupt the protests there. And I think, as Matthew LaRiche points out in the context of South Sudan, this is a very similar thing, or Sudan in general, where you have multiple and competing forces that are engaged in a variety of different activities, often in ways that make identifying liability or drawing clear lines of culpability very difficult to do, and which seems to be a very intentional strategy pursued by regimes across African and indeed North American cases as well. And so I don't know if there's any other panelists want to jump in. Mai?
Yeah, so something that, I'm not sure if this is so much an answer, but something that the questioners have all gotten me thinking about is that it's very true that there are many different policing or security apparatus agencies in many of these African countries. Many units are used for just different tasks. And so if we're thinking about this in a more like bureaucratic or administrative state, one of the things that this can do is breed a lot of competition between these agencies. And so some past research that I'm drawing on is that when you see many of these multiple agencies competing against each other, they're trying to curry favor with the leader. They're trying to show their stuff. They're trying to like say, well, I'm better. Our unit, our agency is better than another one. That might be a mechanism by which, or reason by which we see more police brutality. If your agency's worth is measured in how many protesters do you kill, for instance, then being more violent might help your agency as opposed to trying to find a solution that is really opaque. How do you measure it if you lowered community tensions, right? And all of these agencies will also have less of a desire or an incentive to share information across different agencies. And in doing that can actually like make police violence that much stronger. So instead of engaging in like really, really targeted repression against one or two agents that are fomenting actual disorder or whatever it is, many of these agencies might have incentive to just engage in much more indiscriminate violence against a whole host of people and many more innocent lives. So definitely this fracturing of police agencies that we're seeing in the US and also seeing in Africa is something to consider, and especially given that many of these agencies in Africa are, who are they accountable to? I'm thinking about what I know in Sudan. Many of these, like the RSF, the Janjaweed, the Rapid Support Forces, probably the most brutal and the largest, the most capable of Sudan's internal security agencies, is not funded by, but getting a lot of money from the EU, and or at least in the past, was getting a lot of funding to help stymie the flow of migrants. And so who are they actually responsible to? So things to think about.
Yeah, can I go?
Of course, yeah. And we have more questions, so don't feel obligated to answer everyone. Please.
Yeah, there was a question on the African countries that have experienced colonialism and how might Africans reconceptualize these institutions. I think Alcinda had talked about it, but I think I just wanted to add a few things. The Kenyan example was a very good one on how to reconceptualize. I think for over 20 years of agitation, I think it was agreed that the best way to reconceptualize the police was to hand over the driving seat to the people and away from the politicians. And that sort of worked because everybody was able to say what they wanted, and the politicians were just speaking about the changes in the police that they need to see like anybody else. And that sort of worked. The problem is that once you have created that mechanism for reconceptualization, and you have done all you can, you have set up new structures, you have set up new laws, the implementation goes back to the same politicians. And that's where the Kenyan reform initiative collapsed. Depending on which type of politicians come into power, they may choose to ignore or replace the changes that were put in place. Like it's happening now in Kenya, the laws are being amended by sheer force of numbers in parliament. Other laws are being created that are taking back the police to what they were before the new constitution. And the whole idea of those changes is basically being negated. And I'll take it back to the issue of political will and what Alcinda said, the whole political infrastructure that the police serve need to change if you really want to change the police to function properly.
Thank you. Maybe we should move on to the next questions, unless Travis, you want to jump in? Is that okay?
Just briefly, I think that the question of who do the police serve? Do they serve the state or do they serve the people? I think that often this sets on a tension of democratization. And in a democratic society, we imagine that the police are there to serve the people. And I think that that might open the door for a broader question, which is often we look for democratic strength by looking at the elections. Are they free? Are they fair? Are opposition candidates allowed to participate? Or like the level of enfranchisement? And I think that the question about the police actually asks us to step back and ask, do those holding the guns, do they serve the people or do they just serve the political status quo? And perhaps that answering that question is a better indicator for democratic strength than whether or not an election was free or fair, which is perhaps not a direct answer to the questions that were raised, but something to think about.
So let me move on. We have a number of questions around basically the state of policing and the possibility of reform. And then we have a question specifically for May. So I'm going to introduce these two issues, and again, feel free to jump in. So first, from Matthew Simonson, we have a question that regards underpolicing. So to what extent do you see underpolicing as a problem in the countries that you study? That is the refusal or incompetence of police to investigate murders, rapes, muggings, etc. What are the consequences of the neglect for local communities? I think Patricia makes a similar point here, that one of the major problems in African countries is not overfunding of police, but actually underfunding. And I'm going to link this to a number of questions that have come on around the question of police reform. So Lisa Mueller asks, is police reform possible in African contexts where terrorism gives a pretext for heightened and militarized policing? And again, on this theme, where did that go? Oh, here we go. So this is from Malta Lear. She said, they say, I'm wondering to what extent police brutality in Africa, like in the US, might be enabled by societal expectations for police to be tough. We tend to think of greater social accountability of police as a solution to police brutality, but I'm not sure that logic works everywhere. And then for Mai specifically, we have a question from Fred Bauma. So Fred asks, Mai, don't you think that what you call the negative revolution is the only thing that interests media and often overshadows other actions by African social movements? For example, the Yenemar Action on Protection is rarely mentioned in the media in Senegal. Lucha, which is a Congolese group that I know Fred is a part of, has done a lot of campaigns around access to water. And unfortunately, these types of actions don't generate much attention in contrast to, say, mass protests on the streets. And so I think he would like you to offer some insights on that. Maybe we'll start with you, and then we can come to the question of underfunding for police and reform possibilities. Yeah.
Great, thanks everyone for those questions. And so one of the first questions that you posed, Zachariah, or the first batch of questions were, is there under policing actually going on? And if so, what are the problems of this under policing? And I think it's very much true about there's not enough policing that's going to stop murders or rapes or robberies or this kind of thing. But one of the things that I would add is then if we added more money or if we added more resources, where are these resources going? Is this money, is this training actually going to go to, thinking about some of the past questions and the discussions that we've had, are these money and resources, are they going to the bread and butter crime divisions that are meant to stop these types of crimes, or instead are they going to the more militarized elements of the police, those that are meant to stop riots instead? And so I think Lisa asked a question about given the security situation. And so one of the things I think about is like, yes, obviously there's terrorism and intense security situations in many, many African countries. But to what extent might that be overblown? I'm not saying that it is, but it's something that we should consider. And is it something that many of these police agencies or different internal security apparatuses do they have an incentive to aggrandize these claims to ensure that more of that funding goes towards them? And so maybe there is under-policing for some of the things that affect people most directly: rape, murder, robberies, these kinds of things. But the problem can't, or the answer just can't be giving more money, because I think the incentives about where the money and the resources and the training are going are not in line with how that would affect regular Africans. And then I think, was it Matthew who asked about negative revolutions in particular? I'm sorry, I didn't write that name down.
Matthew Lariche does have another question, which I haven't posed yet, but if you want to respond, you could paraphrase it as well.
Sorry, but yeah, so whoever asked the question about negative revolutions, in a sense, like that's just what the...
Oh, sorry. So that was Fred Bauma, just to be clear.
Fred, thank you, Fred, for that question. That's a really interesting question, that the people aren't interested in these more traditional, like small scale social movements that are just like fixing water or improving agriculture, or whatever it may be. That's a really interesting point that I hadn't really thought about. But I wonder then, in a sense, like, then what's the point of these? What's the end goal? So is the end goal, if we have this negative revolution and it doesn't result in anything, then does it matter? I mean, the West should be interested in it because they got a lot of people mobilized and acting collectively. But if in these smaller scale movements that actually have concrete actionable items that actually make change, then so the West doesn't pick up on it. But if it makes people's lives in that country better, if it actually improves an issue that many people are concerned with, I think I'd be okay if the West didn't pay as much attention to it, and if it still improved the livelihoods of people. But it's an interesting question. Thanks, Fred.
Other panelists want to jump in here?
Yeah, the question about what explains variation in levels of police brutality across states, is it merely a matter of... I
haven't actually posed that question yet. I don't know if you want to answer the question about underfunding or possibility of police reform. Maybe Travis, you want to go, and Otsieno, if you have any thoughts on underfunding of police and the possibility of police reform, will come to you next.
I'll just jump in quickly to Lisa Mueller's question about whether or not police reform is possible given terrorism. I think that often terrorism and other crises are used as a pretext to increase funding to the police, but as May was saying, then it doesn't actually go towards the day-to-day policing functions. It actually goes to securing the state's power. And so I don't want to be the first one to mention the coronavirus, but in the current global pandemic of the coronavirus, I'm studying actually whether or not this moment, if leaders across Africa are using this as a moment of opportunistic repression, where basically, since the civil society organizations, domestic actors and international actors are focused on the public health concerns of the pandemic, does it create political space for actors to actually engage in increased political violence? And what I find is that that is actually the case. When governments actually enforce the coronavirus lockdowns, it disproportionately, police violence is used against civilians in opposition areas. And that's the case in Uganda, but it's also the case across much of Africa, where these lockdowns are used as a pretext to actually increase police brutality against civilians. And so that's not terrorism, but that's another type of crisis where basically state actors are using these moments to consolidate control.
Otsieno or Alcinda, do you want to go next?
Yeah, underfunding will be an issue, and it has been an issue in Africa, but it will only affect issues like police response when they're called upon, how they respond, how to process cases, or the quality of investigations, but it does not explain why police will be as brutal as they are in most parts of Africa, or probably even in the US. A number of units in Kenya, for example, let's say the anti-terrorism police unit in Kenya is heavily funded by the United States, a big chunk by the European Union, and also by the UK. And if you look at the way that has transformed the anti-terrorism police unit, they've become more brutal and they feel less accountable even internally within the police itself. So I think the problem is not necessarily underfunding, it's mainly a culture that has persisted for a long time within the police that is difficult to transform. And I think part of what needs to be done in police reforms, if the reforms are to be effective, it has to be targeting the police culture, lack of accountability, brutality, and that mentality that police have to use force and police have to ignore the law. To me, that is what I think.
Thank you. Alcinda?
Yes, I will just following up from the point that Otsieno mentioned. I think also we have to look at the responsibility of international partners when they're providing funding for military and police affairs in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, the war on terror has moved a lot of resources towards the continent to crack down on potential terrorism. But that money was not money that was kind of free for, for application or use. It was earmarked and they knew exactly where they wanted to put that money in for what effect. So it's not just a problem, I think, of the local cultures, but also what investments are made and for what. And the connivance between those foreign powers and local autocratic regimes, then they use those fundings, those sources of funding also to bolster their own positions of power by cracking down on opposition groups, etc., etc. And the same happened with the migration issue. As we recall, between 2012 and 2017, there have been 3 or 4 Europe-Africa summits on the migration issue. There was this tremendous moral panic, unfounded in my view, in Europe about the immigrants that were kind of coming over and they were kind of going to transform Europe and etc. And so for European governments, migration, African migration became the major issue. But in reality, more than 80% of Africans who migrate within the continent. Only 20% go outside the continent. But they were unable to see that. They saw this as this avalanche, and we always had these pictures of the Africans.
Well, it looks like we may have lost Alcinda, unfortunately, because it was a super interesting discussion, which leaves us about 5 minutes for maybe one final question and very, very brief responses, either to the question or to anything else that you would like to raise. And I think I like this question from Bridget Coggins because it brings us back to the origins of this panel, which is really trying to think about this trans-regionally to compare the African experience our experiences to the North American experiences. And so let me just raise this last question and I'll turn it back to the panelists for like very quick 30 second or 60-second responses. So Bridget asked, would you say until now that Black Lives Matter and its associated protests have been a blessing or a curse to social justice movements in African states? Have they successfully leveraged Black Lives Matter locally, or have state policing authorities instead been emboldened by the US crackdown? Again, maybe just 30 seconds to 1 minute. Travis, do you want to get us started?
I'm going to take the not fair option. And I think it's actually both. I think that in many ways, seeing the collective action sweep across the United States has emboldened protesters to also demand change, not just in Africa, but in Belarus, facing their elections. This sense of just we as a collective people have to move and be motivated to hold our government and our institutions accountable. But at the same side, I think that we're also seeing this democratic digression where we're actually seeing states that used to uphold human rights, at least ostensibly, engaged in human rights abuses. And I think that that is emboldening autocrats across the world. And so I think that it's kind of doing both at the same time.
Thank you. Maya?
Great, thanks for this question. I think that the BLM movement has been amazing, not even institutionally, but even societally, and thinking about the new conversations that I think, at least from my position, I'm seeing that the Sudanese diaspora and many other African diasporas and people back home are having about the role of colorism, about racism, about ethnicity, and how toxic it is. And if we keep going down that path, or where we are already, how bad that can be for a society and how destabilizing it can be. And so I think just bringing to the forefront that people are different and recognizing that, and talking about how society is built to disadvantage or discriminate against certain peoples. I think that's bringing this back into the conversation has been really, really good.
Otsieno?
Yeah, I think it's both, but for somebody who spends time working on police and doing advocacy with partners of the various countries where policing is a problem, I think it has more disadvantages than advantages. Why? Because in most of African countries, the way we have worked is that sometimes it is difficult for civil society groups to push a government directly to respond. But if you go through its partners, the funding partners, particularly the US, which was seen as a paragon of democracy and respect for human rights, things begin to move. However, when images begin to be played of what was happening with George Floyd, for example, we begin to encounter difficulties talking to authorities who begin to say, oh, but you see, that is how policing is across the world. You see, even the US, which makes a lot of noise, these things are happening there. And I can assure you that we have received those kind of messages. But the other is that some of our key partners, like the United States, begin to shy away discussing these issues publicly. They used to be very vocal, but they begin to shy away from speaking about them. When you meet them, they say, oh, we don't want to engage, we don't want to interfere with Kenyan policing standards unless they contact us directly. So it's a bigger disservice. I don't think images of that nature coming from the US do any good to human rights cause.
Thank you so much, Otsieno. And let me extend my appreciation to all of the panelists, Travis, Otsieno, and Alcinda, who unfortunately wasn't able to come back on, but luckily we benefited from her wisdom for most of this panel. And I encourage all of you to check out the work of each of our panelists. They do really extraordinary stuff. And I think this was a really excellent example of the kinds of ways we can think about these issues in a trans-regional and comparative manner. I encourage you to continue to follow the work of the African Politics Conference Group, and especially the online colloquium series, which will make all of our events public and accessible on the internet. This talk, for example, will be available on our YouTube channel very soon, so please check it out. We will be sure to circulate it once it becomes available. Other than that, let me just thank Amanda Robinson and Natalie Letza for the work that they put into organizing this, as well as all the members of the online colloquium committee. And let me thank all of you in the audience for your truly engaged and spirited discussion that we've had here today. Thank you so much, and I'm going to sign off with that. Have a good day, everyone.